Our next guest is Nick Caters. Nick is the Associate Project Director on the School Board project from our friends at Ballotpedia. As you know, Ballotpedia is a place I'm always trying to send our listeners to get more information on the political world. And in an earlier interview, we had chatted with Daniel Anderson, and Daniel is the head of the School Board project. But if you'll recall from that interview, one of the things Ballotpedia is doing now is they're trying to, map and get statistics, not just for congressional elections and state elections, but they're trying to drill down to the school board level. And I think that's an amazing project, and I salute them for doing this. If you would ask me what the biggest problem in America is today, I wouldn't be talking about dysfunction or polarization in politics. I'd be talking about our educational system. I think it's broken. I think it has to be fixed. And I think when we drill down with the folks at Ballotpedia and look at some of these statistics, and today look at how the voting occurs in school board elections, I think you see that part of the problem is that the process is just not being supported by the general electorate, and maybe we're not getting the quality that we want at the level that's running the school boards and the school districts to begin with. So Nick, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today. And I hope I said your name and your title correctly. What is the Associate Project Director for School Boards? What do you do?
Well, my focus as the Assistant Project Director is to oversee our elections coverage for the School Boards project. So we cover the top 1,000 school districts in the United States based on enrollment. And we cover elections for all 1,000. There are some cases where there's appointed school boards. There's some cases where in like Michigan and New Jersey where you have elections that have been moved and we haven't covered them yet. But we're covering elections in those top 1,000 school districts. I help organize that and sort of determine what to do with the information that we gather from those elections.
So if you're dealing with elections at the national level or perhaps a state level, you pretty much know they're going to be in November. When you're trying to track school board elections, they could be any day of the week, any month of the year almost, couldn't they?
Yeah, so we began covering school board elections in August of 2013. Between August of 2013 and November 5th of 2013, there were 6 different election dates for school districts that we were covering in the top 1,000. A lot of those August, September, October elections have relatively low turnout. They're spread throughout the country. But yeah, you don't have this one unified date for every single school district election in the United States.
Any idea what the history of that is? Why school boards don't get elected on the general election day in November or whatever?
Yeah, there are, a lot of this has to do with simply local control over elections, so that if you have municipal elections and school board elections, that they're controlled by county election boards rather than state election boards. So there may have been some determination back in the 19th century, even the early 20th century, in cases of newer states and newer localities that you have an election at a certain time to separate it out from national elections or state elections. That you have some peculiar dates. I know that Tennessee has elections on Thursdays in August, for example. That a lot of this has to do with sort of local control. And one of the reasons that people who advocate for separate dates, what they say is that they want to keep local elections and nonpartisan elections, when possible, separated out from state and national elections that are usually partisan.
But I think what you're finding, and one of the things we want to talk about today, is that when you have these odd dates at odd times, among other things, the turnout is abysmal.
That's right. Yeah. If you look at even some of the November elections that we covered, that you had, in many cases, turnout between 10 and 15%. In the case of those elections I mentioned in August, September, October, looking at some of those elections, that you might have a turnout between 7 and 12%. So the voter turnout is very, very low for these types of elections.
And Nick, when you say turnout, on one of our earlier shows, we distinguished between turnout as a percentage of the total number of people that could have registered in the beginning and voted, and then there's turnout based upon the number of registered voters. So when you give a statistic, say there was a 10% turnout, is that of the total eligible population or just the registered population?
The numbers I gave are registered.
So 10% of the registered, which means of the total available, you could be at 5% or something, right?
That's right, yeah.
Very low. Are you seeing it, conversely, are you seeing any school boards where you're seeing a decent turnout, 50, 60% turnout, or that just doesn't happen?
You do have some school board elections where you have turnout between 35 to 45%. You have some that push 50%. Right there in your own backyard in Colorado, there were a few elections, Denver Public Schools, Douglas County School District, that they were elections that sort of hovered around 40, 45% turnout. And in part that is because you have other elections, or you had other elections going on in November, namely Amendment 66 and some of the other ballot measures that sort of helped push up some of the turnout, or at least in this case, handing in mail-in ballots.
Right, and for those of you that aren't familiar with the particular Colorado vote, the vote you were talking about was a vote to actually raise taxes or raise revenues for schools, so that was a pretty decent turnout for that election.
That's correct.
And that happened to, again, be a school board election that was on the general election day.
That's right, yes.
But for some of these August dates and whatever, you're seeing a 5 or 6% turnout, or maybe a 10%, but 5 or 6% of the total number that could have voted in the first place.
Right.
And
Yes.
then I assume most of these elections are require a majority vote to win, or a plurality. Excuse me. What are the requirements?
Yeah, typically you'll either have a primary and a general election. So you might have 3 or 4 or more candidates in a handful of cases that run for a particular seat, and the primary narrows it down to 2, and those 2 candidates run in the general election date. Or you do have some cases, I can think of Atlanta Public Schools in Atlanta, Georgia, where some seats had more than 2 candidates run, and they go to a runoff a couple weeks after the election.
These are generally nonpartisan elections.
Yeah, there's only a few cases where you have some, partisan school elections. I'm thinking of some districts in Georgia, Connecticut. I know Syracuse, New York. There are a couple of bigger districts in New York that have partisan elections, but for the most part, they're nonpartisan.
And then we were talking earlier, actually, before we started the show today, that in some areas, at least one particular we're talking about, there are designated seats for sometimes minority participants.
That's correct, yes. In the state of Connecticut, this is the example that I'm familiar with, then the state of Connecticut, state law requires that local boards with partisan elections have a minimum of 3 minority party representatives.
So that's in Connecticut, but not necessarily in other states.
Yeah, that's just the Connecticut state law. I haven't really come across any state laws like that in any of the other states that we covered.
But other than electing the minority representatives, are there any unique voting requirements, a certain percentage of the vote for someone, or the only minority representatives vote on those seats, or does everyone vote for those seats?
Everyone votes for those seats, and essentially what they do is they'll take the top however many seats are up. So if it's in the case of Bridgeport Public Schools, there were 5 seats up. They look at the top 5. If anyone sort of runs up against that minimum, they'll sort of go to the next candidate and they'll sort of figure it out from there. But everyone votes on all of the candidates on the ballot.
So Bridgeport is actually an example, I think a fascinating example of how low turnout can swing things here. You and I were talking, and the population of Bridgeport was somewhere around 60,000, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, no, we didn't know how many of those 60,000 would be eligible to register to vote, but even if it was half, and I'm sure it was more than half, you'd have 30,000 people arguably could register and could vote in the election. And what was the turnout for that election?
It was some 4,600 votes. Just doing some quick math, I think that's around 15%.
Based on our 30,000 number, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Based on our 30,000.
yeah, like 15% or 60. Whatever,
yeah, something. I mean, it's a relatively low turnout.
But this was a very interesting election because there was a group that had come in to establish some reforms. Other people hadn't necessarily reacted well to those reforms. So there was some energy around this election, yet you only had maybe a 15% turnout at best.
That's right. Just to give a little bit of backstory, for Bridgeport Public Schools, you had a case where you have a state takeover of the district in 2011, that you have after the state Supreme Court finds that the takeover was in fact unconstitutional, that you have a new superintendent and you have in fact new elections in 2012 to determine the composition of the Board of Education. And the people who sort of controlled the Board of Education prior to November 5th of 2013, and in fact the superintendent, wanted to bring about reforms. They looked at poor academic performance, they looked at some financial struggles for the district, and they began to sort of add some new elements and experiment with some new ideas in that district. What happens in September of 2013 is that you have 3 Democratic members of the board who were pro-reform and pro-superintendent, Paul Vallis, that's the superintendent in this case, that they are challenged by 3 newcomers. They are against Paul Vallis, they are against some of these reforms. They feel that they're harming the performance overall of the district. And in fact, those 3 challengers in the Democratic primary in September of 2013 win. And in fact, they win the seats in the general election on November 5th. So you see some significant change there. Now, as you mentioned, there's a lot of energy surrounding this. But again, you have a relatively low voter turnout in a medium-sized city with a lot of issues in its public schools.
And that's what I think is stunning to me, whether it's Bridgeport or somewhere else. And again, we're not here to say who should win these elections, but if 4,600 people voted, my math tells me just one more than 2,300 was needed to win a seat. So you have a case where the entire school board and the schools of this Bridgeport, Connecticut, are going to be run by people who got elected with, 8% of the total vote. So what is this? What is Ballotpedia's take on this low turnout and the impact of these low turnouts?
Well, we don't take necessarily a position on this. We simply provide sort of a neutral and nonpartisan source of information. But certainly the conclusion that you can draw from some of this raw data is that low voter turnout means that you can have significant swings from one set of board members to another set of board members with only a few hundred, or even in this case, a few thousand votes. If you switch a few hundred votes here and there, and some of these other candidates who didn't win end up getting those votes, then you have a different composition of the board. So low voter turnout means that it is easier to swing control over a Board of Education, in this case, from one set of policies to another set of policies. And because of low voter turnout, it doesn't take very much money and it doesn't take very much effort to actually sort of push in one direction or the other.
Well, these are great statistics, Nick, and I want to encourage all our viewers to find your site, drill down, and maybe get educated on their own districts and look at their turnouts. We've been encouraging people to register to vote, to turn out to vote, get active in issues. And if there's any place you want to turn out and vote and get active, to me, it's got to be on education. So, Nick, if someone wants to go to Ballotpedia and see your work and look at some results, where should they go? What should they do?
Go to ballotpedia.org, and on that page you'll find a link to the School Boards Project. And what we do is we not only cover elections, but we look at school districts, school policies. We have some great articles, one dealing with the Common Core curriculum implementation throughout the United States. We have some sort of specific looks at things like school district budgets. We're looking at, we started to look at school violence in the United States, the history of it going back to 1990. So, we're building this up over time, and we'll add more information as we go along. And we're starting to get into election coverage with Oklahoma elections coming up in February of this year.
Thank you so much for your time, and I'm sure anybody that goes to that site is going to be amazed with what they find. So, best wishes to everyone back at Ballotpedia, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for your time.